forget to say it or you step out earlier, I guess if you've got a name tag for it, it's there, but maybe lounge just straight across the quad over there, and we'll have coffee at 3:30. So we'll start off this session here. We've got a couple more patristic focused texts or papers here, and the first one is by Mark Lindahl, who's a graduate student with us, and so please welcome him. I also have, if you didn't get a handout that's on the, I've got a handout. Does anybody need one that I can
I hope it's all right if I don't just stand up here behind the podium. I might want to walk around a little bit. I was actually expecting a lot fewer people here. Dr. Street told me that there would be maybe around 10 people, maybe less. I thought maybe we could just arrange the chairs in a circle and kind of have a little chat together, but that's great that so many of you came out. I assume you came out just because you saw Ethiopian Canon. You're like, man, I've got to be there to learn about the Ethiopian Canon. So he also told me all of you would be experts in the Ethiopian Canon. What do you know about the Ethiopian Canon, or the Ethiopian Church in general? Does anyone have any background in it, or maybe know a fact or two?
They like the books of Enoch?
Yes, that is usually the first thing that's said, and sometimes the only thing that's said also. They like the book of Enoch, so they have the book of Enoch, or Enoch. Right, okay. Anything else? Yeah, so before I started really delving into this, that was about the extent of my knowledge as well. But in kind of diving into it, there's so many unique character traits, there's so many distinctives, so many unusual phenomena related to the Ethiopian church, and in particular, the Ethiopian canon. So I want to just see if we can just barely scratch the surface of some of these. So the quote at the top of your page, and everyone has a handout now who wants one? Or does anyone still need one? At the very top of the page, first of all, I wrote the word approach because we're talking about the Ethiopian canon, but in particular, I want to talk about the Ethiopian approach to canon. In other words, their method, or how they view canon. So to give us some insight on that, the quote at the top, the concept of canon is not as rigid as in the West, and that's an understatement. There are various lists, and no one seems to be worried or preoccupied to have something definitive or normative. So imagine that in your church, in your particular tradition. If you went to church and no one knew what the canon was exactly, or people had different Bibles with different books included in them. This is the situation that we see with the Ethiopian canon. So in this approach to examining the canon, I want to first talk a little bit about the background, just to give you an idea of what the Ethiopian church is all about, and we'll kind of take a brief overview of their canon, and then we'll kind of look at some complexities and why it's so complicated to talk about canon in terms of the Ethiopian tradition. And then we'll try to analyze it and see what we can learn, if anything, from their approach. So first of all, the official name, it's not the Ethiopian Church, it's the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. And that's listed there on the top of your handout. Ethiopian, referring to the country in ancient times that was known as the Kingdom of Axum. Their language, Ethiopic, or more properly called Ge'ez. That's the ancient language of Ethiopia. See, okay. That's the ancient language of Ethiopia. It's still the liturgical language that they use today in church. And then they speak Amharic today. So that comes from Ge'ez. Ge'ez is the ancestor of Amharic, and these are both Semitic languages. So Orthodox, that word is not referring to the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but rather the Oriental Orthodox tradition. And that's different in one particular key way. They reject the Chalcedonian definition. Can anyone fill me in on what is the Chalcedonian or Chalcedonian definition? Does anyone remember that? It's the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Do you want to take a stab at it, Timothy?
Talking about how the divine and human natures of Christ are related.
Yeah, exactly.
Are they mixed? Do they have one new nature? Are
Exactly.
they unified?
And the definition that they came up with was that Christ has two natures. He is fully 100% human, and he is fully 100% divine. The Oriental Orthodox Church has rejected this. They said, we don't want to accept that doctrine, and instead they teach what is called miaphysitism. So that's different from monophysitism, which refers to one nature. Miaphysitism would refer to a unified nature of Christ, that his divinity and his human nature are unified. And that brings us to the next word, tewahido. That means unified, or being made one, and that's referring to the unified nature of Christ. And then church, it is the largest of all of the Oriental Orthodox churches. There's about 50 million members worldwide, most of them in Ethiopia. And I have an interesting note. It was granted independence in 1959. That kind of makes it sound like a country. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was for centuries under the jurisdiction and administration of the Coptic Church of Alexandria. And so it was fairly recently that they were granted their independence. So now we have a little bit of a background of the Ethiopian Church. So why, out of all traditions, would we want to investigate the Ethiopian Church? Well, I'll give you just a few reasons of why the Ethiopian tradition, of all traditions, is of particular interest. Number one, it has ancient roots. So, and what this means is, think back to some stories in the Bible. Does anyone has anyone heard of the Queen of Sheba before? I think this is in 1 Kings chapter 10. The Queen of Sheba goes to visit King Solomon, right? And she has a very good visit with him. She returns to Ethiopia and bears his son. His son is named Menelik the First. Menelik goes back to Jerusalem to visit his father in later years, and he meets King Solomon. He goes back to Ethiopia, but when he returns, he takes with him the Ark of the Covenant. So we also hear of Ethiopians in Acts chapter 8. Does anyone remember the story of the Ethiopian eunuch? He was converted by Philip, the evangelist. There are also other traditions. For example, there are traditions that Matthew the apostle traveled to Ethiopia, that he preached the gospel there. And then one other particular point of interest is that the Ethiopian church was actually the second country to accept Christianity and establish it as their state religion in the 4th century AD. The first was Armenia, and the second was Ethiopia. So they have ancient roots. They have disciplined scribes. And what do I mean by that? There are, in fact, 3 books that we have in their entirety only in the Ge'ez language. And those are the books of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah. And you may be saying, wait, I thought we had the book of Enoch and other places where they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, they did, but they found fragments of it. It's contained in its entirety only in Ge'ez. There are other books also that we have only in Ge'ez, but these are usually used only by the Ethiopian church. And that's, for example, 1st through 3rd Maccabean, which is their version of Maccabees, the Ethiopic Didascalia, and the Ethiopic Clement, and those are also their own versions of these books that are different in content from those same named books outside of the Ethiopian tradition. And as I mentioned before, they have a very inclusive canon. So to see just how inclusive it is, I want you all to turn over your handout. Does anyone still need a handout who maybe came in later? Dr. Blackwell, do you still have those handouts? I think there's a couple in the back.
Okay, go ahead, share. I think they're open.
Okay, I might have a couple more. I'm getting those. Thanks. Appreciate it. Okay, just from taking a look at this backside here, you can see that obviously the Ethiopian Orthodox canon is a very full and inclusive canon. If you look over to the right side at the Protestant canon, and there's what appears to be all of these gaps. So what I did was on the left side, for the Ethiopian church, I bolded all of the books that are in the Ethiopian canon but are not found in the Protestant canon. So you see that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, their canon, has all of the books of the Protestant canon. So if we talk about just the Old Testament, it has all the books of the Hebrew Bible. It has all the books of the Catholic Deuterocanon. It has a number of books that the Eastern Orthodox churches have, maybe with the exception of 4th Maccabees. And then they have a few other books as well that are not found in any of those other 3 traditions. For example, the remainder of Jeremiah, or in other words called 4th Baruch. Or at the very end of the Old Testament, you'll see Joseph ben Gurion. And in the New Testament, they have the same 27 books that every other tradition has, with an additional 8 books at the end. And these are sometimes known as the books of church order. And so these ones are found only in the Ethiopian canon. So that just kind of gives you a brief background and also reasons why we should investigate the Ethiopian canon. So let's take a look at the sources of the Ethiopian canon. So I divided it up into exogenous sources as well as indigenous. Exogenous coming from sources outside of Ethiopia. So we have 2 main exogenous sources. We have the apostolic canons, and now here where we use the word canons, I just don't want anyone to be confused. This is referring to canon law rather than what books we include in the Bible. So the apostolic canons, this is a document that is well known in Christendom, but just not usually accepted as authoritative. It's written in the voice of Clement, but most people think it was written hundreds of years later than when Clement lived. And so the apostolic canons actually account for the vast majority, or I shouldn't say the majority, but quite a bit of the Ethiopian canon as it stands today. For example, those 8 books of church order at the end of the New Testament, that comes from the apostolic canons. That's where they get that from. There are a number of books, however, that are not included in the apostolic canons, and let me just name a few. So we have the book of Judith, the book of Tobit, the Wisdom of Solomon, additional books of Jeremiah, the book of Revelation. None of these are found in the apostolic canons, but they are found in another document written around that time also. It's the 39th Festal Letter of Athanasius. So these 2 sources are the main sources, the main exogenous sources for the Ethiopian canon. As far as indigenous sources, we have a number of canon lists, and we'll just briefly go through each of them. There's one that's probably the most important, that's called the Feta Nagast. So this means Law of the Kings in Ge'ez. And this is where we get the idea that there are 81 books in the canon. And it has a lot of similarities with the apostolic canons. There's 3 translations of a non-Ethiopian document called the Synodos. And each of the translations attempts at making a canon list, and each canon list is different from the others. So it's obvious that they weren't exact translations, but that whoever translated them also input their own opinions in there as well. We also have the Amharic Bible, the actual printed Bible that the church uses. That would be, in my opinion, the first place I would go if I wanted to know, well, what's in the Ethiopian canon. I'd open up one of their Bibles and look. But in the Ethiopian tradition, that's just one of many sources of canon. And then finally, the Council of Scholars. So there's an official council of the church is called this Council of Scholars of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. And they get together and they discuss these issues. And they've been meeting together once or twice every year for decades. And in recent years, they've been publishing what they talk about when they meet together. And so I think it was back in 1980, I think was one of their last published documents, where they actually give a canon list and they say, this is what's on our canon. The only problem is it doesn't agree with any of the other lists, and none of the other lists agree with each other with each other either. They all have, or almost all of them have 81 books of the canon, with one exception. One of the translations of the Synodos does not have 81 books. They actually came up with 63. The rest of them all have 81 books, and they all come up with the number of 81 in different ways. So that is the problem. Now, there are significant divergences from these different canon sources, and I'll just briefly mention those. So while most indigenous lists include at least what the apostolic canons includes, a notable exception is 1st and 2nd Clement. None of the current canon lists include 1st and 2nd Clement, as you can see on the back side here. It's not there, but it was in the apostolic canons. So why they didn't include it? Not sure. Second anomaly, there doesn't seem to be any exogenous source for including the books of Jubilees or Enoch. The Ethiopian canon is the only canon within the realm of Christianity that includes those 2 books. And then the third anomaly, there is no indigenous or exogenous source for including the book of Ezra Sutuel. And that's included in the Council of Scholars' most recent list. So if you look on the left column, Ethiopian Orthodox, you look down, Kings, Chronicles, Jubilees, Enoch, Ezra, Nehemiah, and you have 2nd Ezra and Ezra Sutuel. So that book, interestingly, was just added to their canon recently, within the past few decades. Now, it is an ancient book, but why did they add it? It wasn't in any of these other exogenous or indigenous canon lists. Someone, or the council, just decided, let's add it. So that kind of gives you an idea of the sources of canon formation, and it also kind of starts to introduce all the complexities that we deal with when talking about the Ethiopian canon. So the complexities all stem from one source, and that is the Feta Nagas, the document called the Law of the Kings, which we already referenced. In that document, it mentions explicitly that there are 81 books of the canon, and then it proceeds to list them, and it lists 73. That is the source of all of this confusion. There are 81 books of the canon, only 73 listed. And so what do you do with that? Well, everyone just comes up with a different list. There's actually an official commentary on the Feta Nagast, and they basically account for it by adding those 8 additional books at the end of the New Testament, those books of church order. And that's how they account for it. But not everyone agrees with that, and so everyone usually sticks to the standard of 81 books of the canon, but then they all come up with that number. in different ways. So some other complexities, real quick here. Some naming conventions. And what I mean by that, let me just give you an example. The book of, going back to Ezra Sutuel, which we mentioned already, that can also be known as 2nd Esdras, 4th Esdras, 4th Ezra, Latin Esdras, or the Jewish Apocalypse of Ezra, but it cannot be confused with the Greek Apocalypse of Ezra because that is a completely different text. So it can get very confusing, as you can see. Also, some books are combined together. Some books are separated apart. If you find Proverbs on the left column, you'll notice that it's actually in 2 different books. And if you see any indentations, for example, the prayer of Manasseh under 2nd Chronicles, that means it's actually included as part of the book of 2nd Chronicles. So you see with these contractions and expansions of books, then you get a lot of confusion in the canon. Also, there are some mysterious books of the Ethiopian canon. And what I mean by that is there are some books included in canon lists that are actually not published by the church or not published at all in Ge'ez or in Ethiopia. In fact, sometimes the only way you can get these books is by some kind of modern translation into a European language. And so that's how you get these books. And there is a reason for that. It's not just that they're trying to keep these books from people. So in the Apostolic Canons is a quote from, they attribute it to Clement, "The constitutions dedicated to you in 8 books," so those 8 books at the end of the New Testament, "which it is not fit to publish before all because of the mysteries contained in them." And the church stays true to that. They do not publish those last 8 books of the New Testament canon. And you can notice that I put a double asterisk there next to those last 8 books, which means that those books are included in the canon, but not actually printed in the Bible. And then a third reason for complexity is that there's no modern authoritative figure who will say, this is the official canon list. Now, there are those who have tried. We have the Council of Church Scholars, for one. And then also back in the 60s, there's the Emperor of Ethiopia. His name was Haile Selassie I. He actually said, we're going to solve this issue of canon once and for all. And he brought all the scholars together and he said, I want you to figure it out. And when you figure it out, we're going to print a Bible, and that will be the complete Bible of Ethiopia. And they did exactly that, and they printed it in Amharic, their modern language, and the emperor declared, this is the complete Bible of Ethiopia. Now the issue is, what authority does the emperor have? The emperor has authority over the country. Does he have the authority to consider or to declare a Bible complete? Well, I guess most people didn't think so because that didn't really stick, unfortunately. So in the remaining minutes that we have, I want to give you some time for questions. I want to just go through some of the weaknesses as well as some of the strengths of this Ethiopian approach to canon. So weaknesses, let's start with the weaknesses first of all. The most apparent weakness, it is very confusing. Coming up with this list here took a really long time because the Ethiopian canon is very confusing. What are the clergy supposed to teach out of? What are the lay people supposed to read? We don't even know what the canon list is. Now, there are some explanations for this. I think if you actually asked an Ethiopian clergy, a priest or something, I don't think he'd have a problem. He would know what he reads from, and I think the lay person would be the same. I don't think they would have any issue with the fact that there is some confusion with the canon. Sometimes we might look at that and say, well, that just seems unprofessional. You don't even have a complete canon. Or even worse, that's uninspired. But we have to remember that that's coming from our Western perspective. If we were to look at first century Christians and their canon, it might be similar. They didn't have a complete canon either. We would never call them unprofessional or uninspired. Another weakness, there are those books that people cannot access, but that's not without precedent. We know that Paul, he speaks of the mysteries of God and hidden things, hidden wisdom that the eye hath not seen nor the ear heard. And third weakness, the Ethiopian Bible may be inclusive to a fault. It may be including things that really shouldn't be included in the Bible. So this is a legitimate concern, but it's not unique only to the Ethiopian church. I think that's a concern for any canonical tradition, that we always need to be on our toes to not accept works that are uninspired. And furthermore, perhaps being too exclusive may also be detrimental as well to a canon. So what strengths are there, just in these last couple minutes here? The strengths that I saw were, number one, the Ethiopian canon, the scribal tradition, preserves texts. We have all these texts that would have been lost had it not been for the Ethiopian church. They include books, in fact, perhaps to a benefit. And here's what I mean by that. So they include the book of Enoch. Now, regardless of what your opinion is on the book of Enoch, it makes sense to include the book of Enoch because it is quoted in our Bibles by Jude. So if you look down at the very bottom of your handout, you'll see that quote there. This is from 1 Enoch. The Ethiopians just call it Enoch. In the first chapter, in verse 9. Look, he comes with the myriads of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to destroy all the wicked, and to convict all humanity for the wicked deeds that they have done, and the proud and hard words that wicked sinners spoke against him. So if we include Jude in our canon, then does it make sense then not to include Enoch, saying that that's not inspired? And finally, the Ethiopian approach to canon provides the ability to debate and to discuss canon, rather than just have one authoritative figure or one council decide it, and then that's the end. The Ethiopian approach says, well, let's talk about it, let's discuss it, and we will take different views. So perhaps an overall look at the Ethiopian canon. Maybe it has some certain weaknesses, but also there are significant strengths. There are significant positives to the Ethiopian approach to Scripture that I think could be a boon and a benefit to any church or tradition that should choose to adopt it. Thank you.